Okay, take two. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Dave Armstrong, and it's my joy to welcome Reverend John Stott this afternoon. One or two things we do want to mention, because we're not sure that everyone who wanted to be here is able to get in. It looks like a full house. We are going to produce a video, and that will be available, along with all the other videos at the center by the tent. I want to mention, I've never mentioned anything on birds in books before, as far as I can remember, and I've sold millions of Christian books around the world, but this is John Stott's book, The Birds, Our Teachers. And this afternoon, if you're getting one of these, there'll be a signing session just on the way out through that door there. So do take advantage of this, because it mentions here that John has actually seen 2,500 species of birds. Over 9,000. And this is from £8.99 down to £7.99, a special price for this week at Keswick. I want to tell you a very interesting story. A few years ago, it was my job with Operation Mobilization and STL to distribute Christian books and Bibles around the world. And every year I'd travel through Africa. And I was on a plane with my wife, flying from Nairobi down to Malindi. And my wife came to me, she said, I've just seen someone down at the front of the plane, and he's reading one of the books that you're selling. And so I was interested to find out who this person was. It turned out to be Reverend Stott. And he was heading to Malindi because there's great wildlife down there, and he was on a bird tour trip. So that was one of the first times I got to meet you. Very interesting too. So it's my joy this afternoon, Reverend Stott, to welcome you. Let's give him a warm welcome. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for your kind welcome. Is this on? Yeah. I would like to particularly welcome those of you who are from the town, from Keswick, because we believe there are a number of people here who are not at the convention, but who live locally. And we want you to know that you're very welcome at this particular meeting. It was Francis Bacon, the 17th century naturalist, philosopher, and lawyer, who said that God has not written one book, but two. The first book he called the book of his works, which is nature, and the second is the book of his words that we call Scripture. So God has revealed himself twice over, once in the natural universe, in the ordered loveliness of the created universe, and once in the Bible. So I myself am convinced that nature study and Bible study go hand in hand, and that we ought to be more interested in the natural world than many of us are, because the natural world is God's creation. And as we study Scripture, we are thinking God's thoughts after him, to quote that well-known astronomer, Johann Kepler. But while we're studying nature in scientific study, we are also thinking God's thoughts after him, as we're investigating these two revelations of his. Now, people have asked me from time to time how I got hooked on bird watching, and I mentioned it, I think, in the tent the other day. But my father was a cardiologist, a heart physician, and like most doctors and scientists, he was very interested in all branches of natural history. He was an expert amateur botanist, and he used to take me out for walks in the country during the summer holidays and tell me to shut my mouth and open my eyes and ears. And it was an excellent training in observation. I was only 5 or 6 years old at the time, but I took up butterflies first. For a small boy of about 8, I had a really very fine butterfly collection, until one day my sister, one of my siblings with whom I had an ongoing rivalry, and hostility, threw a cushion at me while I was setting the butterflies, and it landed in the middle of the butterfly box. And I tell you, if I've ever seen red, I saw it then. And I chased her round and round the round table in the nursery, and I reckon I would have killed her if I'd caught her. But fortunately, in the providence of God, she was more agile than I, and I didn't catch her. Anyway, I was utterly disconsolate for about 3 days. My father tried to mend the butterflies with glue, but it was no good. So it's, to me, a very interesting example of the providence of God, that although I was very sorry for myself then, I'm glad now because I switched from butterflies to birds. Now, people think I'm peculiar enough to go around the world carrying a pair of binoculars, but supposing I'd gone around the world with a butterfly net. So I'm very thankful now. And I have traveled all over the world, and bird watching is a wonderful hobby for those who travel because there are birds everywhere, from the desert to the tropical rainforest and from the Arctic to the Antarctic. And tonight this afternoon, I'm going to show you some pictures that have been brought together from several trips I've made to the Arctic, the Canadian Arctic, way north of the Arctic Circle. And I've called it Arctic Adventure, a quest for the snowy owl. I don't know why it is, but the snowy owl, that is a circumpolar bird, it's all round the North Pole, in Siberia, in Lapland, in the Canadian Arctic, Greenland, and so on. And nobody knows how many there are because they breed in the uninhabited Arctic tundra. And I spent, I think it was 25 years, looking for a breeding pair of snowy owls, which I could then photograph. And you'll see how the story unfolds.
Now that your laughter has subsided, perhaps I may ask you a question. I wonder what images the word Arctic conjures up in your mind. Icebergs, perhaps, of various shapes and sizes, or beautiful Eskimo or Inuit children, or maybe 5 million square miles of treeless tundra. Or perhaps it is the wildlife, for example, the glaucous gull, which never leaves the Arctic and has almost transparent wings. Or again, the sleek Arctic wolf, which the Inuit call Amaruk. And certainly we know that the Arctic is the land of the midnight sun, which in the summer never drops below the horizon. My first visit to the frozen north was in 1973. It began in Churchill on the western shore of Hudson Bay and concluded at Bathurst Inlet Lodge in the center of the map. My birdwatching companion on this trip was Gordon Johnson, now Professor of Ophthalmology at University College London, while his wife Anne, a pediatrician, and their 9-month-old son David joined us later at Bathurst Inlet Lodge. When we arrived in Churchill, Hudson Bay had not yet completely thawed, and the spruce trees were an indication that we were still in the sub-Arctic zone. Hudsonian godwits liked to perch precariously on the topmost twigs, and the lesser yellowlegs looked distinctly ungainly and uncomfortable, while the short-billed dowitcher was sensible enough to stay in its natural habitat on the ground and at the water's edge. To reach Bathurst Inlet Lodge, just north of the Arctic Circle, we flew from Yellowknife on a DC-3. Our destination was that little cluster of buildings at the mouth of the Burnside River. Bathurst Inlet Lodge, spelled out in Caribou antlers, was originally a Hudson Bay trading post. Then, in 1935, it became a Roman Catholic mission. But in 1964, the abandoned buildings were bought by Glenn Warner, a former Royal Canadian Mounted Policeman. Glenn and Trish have done a marvelous job converting the place into a lodge during the brief Arctic summer for birdwatchers and other wildlife enthusiasts. For all around is a magnificent panorama of tundra, hills, lakes, and sea, with the nearest other human habitation some 50 to 60 miles away. Next door to the lodge is a group of government-supplied, prefabricated fiberglass igloos in which about 25 Inuit live. They are partners in the enterprise with Glenn and Trish, so let me now introduce their leaders to you. This is Mary Tapana, the matriarch of the whole community. And here is John, her husband, the senior man. Together, Mary and John make a fine couple of leaders, impressive in their caribou skin clothing. John is a very skilled fisherman. For Arctic char, a species of salmon, sliced and hung up to dry in the summer, is one of the community's staple foods during the winter. A young boy visitor tried his hand at fishing, but caught nothing, which is not altogether surprising, as he was only 5 years old. Alongside Mary and John lived the next 3 generations, including their great-grandchildren, who loved to play with the husky pups. During the 2.5 months of Arctic summer, the ice and snow melt, and the wild flowers come out. God's garden, I like to call it. Here are mountain avens, or Arctic dryas, a member of the rose family and the floral emblem of Canada's Northwest Territories. And Arctic lupins, and purple saxifrage. And here is white alpine saxifrage, while this is the elegant Indian paintbrush, and the dainty little Arctic poppy. Every day we went off on an expedition by boat. A favorite destination was the narrow gorge whose waters fed the Burnside River, and at one point created a mighty waterfall. It was here that, high up the gorge's precipitous cliffs, a pair of gyr falcons had built their eyrie. They are authentic birds of the far north. Gyr falcons feed on Arctic ground squirrel, or the sick, as the Inuit call them on account of their rather metallic chatter. Gyr falcons like ptarmigan too, which lose their white plumage in the summer months. On my first visit to Bathurst Inlet Lodge, I found myself appointed the honorary chaplain to the Inuit community. So, in fulfillment of my chaplaincy duties, I officiated at several weddings. Here are Peter, Mary's grandson, and Martina. While here are Robert and Martha, the bride wearing a charming coronet of wild Arctic rhododendrons. Later, I had the joy of baptizing their babies. This is Tommy Agnakyok. And this is Connie, daughter of Joseph and Mary Kanyak, who were camping nearby. But alongside joy came pain. For Jacob Avadluk, the 19-year-old Inuk by the waterfall, went swimming the following day and unaccountably drowned.
There was no undertaker, of course, nor any of the trappings of a Western funeral, but the local RCMP flew in from Cambridge Bay, some 250 miles away, to certify the death. That evening, I was asked to officiate at the funeral. It was a most moving occasion. But as I proclaimed the words of Jesus, "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live, though he dies," the whole sky seemed to respond in a blaze of orange glory. Let me now introduce you to some of the other birds which breed in the Arctic. Here is the lovely little Lapland longspur. And this is the rather rare yellow-billed loon. The female eider duck actually plucks eider down from her breast with which to line her nest. While the Arctic terns perform the astonishing feat of flying down to the southern tip of Africa for the winter, a journey there and back of about 20,000 miles every year. By contrast, here is the familiar American robin, which we were very surprised to find so far north. Caribou, which are the reindeer of North America, also migrate south for the winter, although only to the forests of southern Canada. Caribou are the Inuits' best friends, for they supply them with food, clothing, and blankets. They are powerful swimmers, which is when they are most vulnerable to the gun. One day when I was there, the Inuit shot 12 and brought them home by boat. Immediately Jessie, Mary's daughter, began to cut up the caribou meat with her razor-sharp ulu knife. The other large mammal of the Arctic tundra is the majestic muskox. We were lucky to stumble across a small herd in the pasture. The muskox is a prehistoric relic from the last ice age. In those far-off days it roamed over much of Europe and Asia, as well as America. At the beginning of this century, however, it was almost extinct. But since 1917, they have been protected by law so that they are now no longer an endangered species. The muskox, or umingmak, the bearded one, as the Inuit call it, can endure the bitterest Arctic winter because it has two coats, a thick, shaggy overcoat and an undergarment of silky wool warmer even than cashmere. Musk oxen are wild, shy creatures, so when one turned to face me and began to snort and paw the ground, I knew the time had come to make a prudent retreat. Our most exciting experience while at Bathurst Inlet Lodge was an expedition in the Cessna on floats some 250 miles east into the uninhabited tundra. We flew over a maze of colored lakes until at last we reached Lake Carrick, on whose islands the white geese, which are only white dots in this picture, were known to breed. As we came down, snow geese were flying all around us, snow white, as indeed their name implies, except for their black wingtips. There has always been something romantic about these birds, at least since the publication of Paul Gallico's famous story, The Snow Goose. A portrait of this handsome bird reveals its rather strange grey horizontal grin. Blue geese were also nesting on the island. They used to be regarded as a separate species, but now are known to be a dark phase of the snow goose. Our main quest, however, was the much rarer Ross's goose, which winters in valleys of central California. In fact, here is one which I photographed some years later in California. The Ross's goose is similar to the snow goose, but it's smaller and it lacks the facial grin. We were distressed when, at our approach, all the geese got up off their nest and began to walk away from us. But one bird stayed put, and we soon learned why. It was her gorgeous golden gosling. After hatching, the gosling stays in the nest for only about 24 hours, so we were lucky to arrive just when the hatching was taking place. One gosling, which had already left the nest, fixated on Gordon Johnson, and he had considerable difficulty in severing the relationship. The bond of Ross's goose was much of the picture. Despite my 4 visits to Bathurst Inlet Lodge as its honorary chaplain, I had still not seen a snowy owl. But in 1986 I had the opportunity to go further north to Frobisher Bay, Resolute, and Little Cornwallis Island. Would I see the fabulous isle this time? Steve Andrews, one of my former study assistants, joined me on this expedition. Frobisher Bay, now called Iqaluit, is the headquarters of the Anglican Diocese of the Arctic, and this is St. Jude's Cathedral, built to resemble an igloo. On the average cathedral close, one can expect to find sparrows, but St. Jude's Cathedral was favored with snow buntings. The male is pure white, apart from some black on the wing, and in flight it looks like a random snowflake. The interior of the cathedral is decorated with Inuit art, and the communion rails consist of 2 sleds or toboggans on their side. Colorful cloth banners on the east wall depict typical scenes of both Inuit family life and of Arctic wildlife. The font has been carved out of a beautiful block of green soapstone and was presented by Her Majesty the Queen when she visited Frobisher in 1970. While the black cross is adorned with the spiral tusks of the narwhal whale, sometimes referred to as the unicorn of the ocean. The Dean of the Cathedral is Mike Gardiner, a veteran of the Arctic and a devoted pastor. He translated my Sunday sermon into Inuktitut. Mike was assisted by 2 Inuit lay readers. And here are a mother and her baby, who were part of the Sunday morning Inuit congregation of about 300. Frobisher Bay itself was still frozen, and there were hardly any birds to be seen anywhere. But Jimmy Papazzi, leader of the Cathedral Youth Group, who had a healthy team of 5 huskies, the lead dog being the mother of the other 4, took us on an exhilarating sled expedition. The dogs pulled us over the frozen bay at a fine speed. Our flight to Resolute took us over a vast expanse of ice, intersected by channels of blue water. Although Resolute has only 200 inhabitants, it has its own little Anglican church. Outside several houses, polar bear skins were stretched on frames to dry in the sun. Our most fascinating sight was a giant iceberg, which had floated down from Ellesmere Island in the far north. We visited it by snowmobile shortly before midnight, as it towered at least 100 feet above us. Another day we flew to so-called Beechy Island, which is actually a peninsula at the southwest tip of Devon Island. It's a historic site in relation to Sir John Franklin's 19th century expeditions in search of the Northwest Passage. His third was fatal, for he and his whole crew of 128 officers and men perished. Numerous ships were dispatched to look for them, and at last one found some equipment and graves on Beechey Island, seen in the background, where Franklin and his men spent the winter of 1845 to 46. So a monument was erected in that desolate spot to commemorate both Franklin's crew and those who died while searching for them. Close by, we found 4 graves where some of Franklin's men were buried. The most legible inscription commemorates John Torrington, who died aged 20 on the 18th of January, 1846. His body has recently been disinterred, having been perfectly preserved in that natural refrigerator. Rod Douglas joined Steve and me at Resolute, having been Vice President for Field Operations of Cominco, the Consolidated Mining Company. He has an extensive knowledge of the Arctic. He kindly arranged for the 3 of us to stay at Polaris Mine on Little Cornwallis Island. It's the most northerly metal mine in the world, extracting lead and zinc from ore. We were taken underground one day, clad in orange-brown dungarees and hard hats, and were very impressed by the whole operation. Above ground again, we were amazed that a hairy caterpillar could survive in that intense cold. An Arctic fox, which had molted about half its white winter coat, was in hot pursuit of something it could smell, and it took a rather unwelcome fancy to us. From Polaris Mine, we flew further north still to Polar Bear Pass on Bathurst Island, not far south of the magnetic North Pole. From the air, we could just about make out the huts on that small and barren plateau in the middle of the picture. Here, in 1968, some Canadian scientists from Ottawa set up their High Arctic Research Station. All round us was the great white wilderness, about 7,000 uninhabited square miles. The genius behind the research station is Stu MacDonald, a biologist and ornithologist of world renown. He is well known for this picture, which he took of an aggressive ivory gull, whose breeding grounds he discovered in the high Arctic. Each day, we went on an expedition, often by snowmobile and sled. There were no signs of spring flowers yet, only brightly colored lichens. So here are your 3 Arctic explorers, wrapped up against a temperature of several degrees below zero. One commodity of which there was no shortage was water, since we used melted snow. Very few birds had arrived yet, but 3 Brent geese in procession delighted us. They winter in Northern Ireland. On other days we sallied forth on foot, still hoping against hope for a snowy owl. Instead we came across a snow den of, what do you think? Of Arctic hare, still in their pure white fur coats. They were also unbelievably tame. The main subject of Stu MacDonald's research was the rock ptarmigan, a circumpolar grouse, the same species as the Scottish ptarmigan. This is a female, her white winter coat already flecked with brown. And here's another, almost entirely brown. In contrast, the male still had his immaculate white plumage. His red comb adds to his distinction, especially when he inflates it in courtship, display, or in aggression. The nearest we got to a polar bear was its fresh footprints in the snow. Our main compensation for not seeing either a polar bear or a snowy owl was a shy Arctic wolf, which, attracted by smells emanating from our kitchen, gave us an unusual sight of its graceful elegance. As the twin otter flew in to fetch us, we promised ourselves another Arctic expedition in undiminished pursuit of the ever-elusive snowy owl. It's 1991 now, and to celebrate my 70th birthday, some friends and I planned a visit to Cambridge Bay on Victoria Island, while 5 years later I visited Sachs Harbour to the west and returned to Cambridge Bay. Cambridge Bay is one of the main locations of the so-called dew line, or distance early warning system, which straddles the frozen north. Cambridge Bay is also great for birds. Here, for example, is the lovely red phalarope. In response to our numerous inquiries about snowy owls, we were directed to Mount Pelly, which you can see on the horizon. So here we pitched our tents. David Spence, president of the Langham Foundation, is in the middle of the picture. And on the right are Rod Douglas in his red cap and his doctor friend, Morley Phillips. On our first day there, Rod caught a delicious 2-pound Arctic char, which we had for our supper. Walking round the base of Mount Pelly, we found a nesting tundra swan. You'll agree it's a very handsome creature, and Morley spent the whole night in the hide, which we had erected near the nest. Another bird we enjoyed was the red-throated loon, or red-throated diver, as we call it in Britain. We pitched our tent hide close to its island nest. And we had the joy of watching it return to the nest and resume incubation. The American golden plover is another Arctic breeder, but believe it or not, it winters as far south as Australia. Similar to the golden plover, but arguably more beautiful, is the grey or black-bellied plover, this one being lit by the midnight sun. These are colourful king eider drakes. We were lucky to see them just before they left land for the open sea. During the short summer, most of the Inuit move out of Cambridge Bay to their fishing camp by the seashore, and this is the tent frame in which we spent a night. Outside, glaucous gulls were standing on the melting ice. We also saw all 3 species of skua or jaeger. This is the pomerine with its strangely twisted tail, while this is the long-tailed skua here on its nest, and here in magnificent flight. This cost. But still no snowy owl, no ukpik, as the Inuit call it. We caught a momentary glimpse of one in flight at a distance of about a quarter of a mile, but that was not good enough. We found no nest. How then could I finish my slide sequence without this anticipated climax? I had an idea. I telephoned the London Zoo. Yes, indeed, they said. They had a pair of snowy owls. I found that the female was quite presentable, but the male was a poor old fellow, 45 years old, suffering from a double cataract. I thought he would never do for the climax. So I just had to return to the beauties of the Arctic tundra to make a final attempt to find and photograph a nesting pair of snowy owls. The chance came in 1996 to celebrate my 75th birthday. This is Saxe Harbor, a little hamlet of 125 people, the only human settlement on Banks Island, the most westerly of the Arctic islands. The mayor of Saxe, Peter Esau by name, welcomed us. That is Steve Andrews, now Dean of the Cathedral in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, and me. And he was extremely hospitable to us throughout our stay. There's an Anglican church in Saxe, but no resident minister. In fact, they hadn't had a Sunday service for 2 or 3 years. So Roger Kuptana, an elder, had agreed that if we got ourselves to Saxe and conducted 2 Sunday services, we would be given free board and lodging. He also lent us this all-terrain vehicle on which Steve and I crisscrossed the surrounding tundra each day. The Kuptana family took us out one evening on a seal hunt, which brought us some 7 miles out to the ice floe. As the flowers were already over on the tundra, we had to be content with the brightly colored lichens, some orange-red and others bright yellow. Birds were scarce too, though we did find and photograph this rough-legged hawk's nest. But where were the nesting snowy owls? Our best hope, we were told, would be Cambridge Bay, Iqaluktupik, as it is called, the fair fishing place. It was good to be back there, to enjoy familiar landmarks, like the wreck of the 3-masted schooner, the Maud. For 7 years, from 1918 to 25, she served under the famous explorer Amundsen in the Arctic. But in 1931, she was abandoned and sank soon afterwards. In charge of St. George's Anglican Mission in Cambridge Bay is Keith Todd, a former All Souls member. He and his wife Barb have 3 delightful children, and they were incredibly kind in their welcome. Outside the town was a nesting colony of the seldom seen Sabine's gull, but they come to land only to breed and spend the rest of the year in the open seas of the southern hemisphere. Now this little fellow, the lemming, is the chief actor in the drama of the snowy owl. The lemmings are their chief diet. When lemmings abound, owls abound. But when lemmings are few, owls are few too. Here is Kevin Smart, Director of Renewable Resources at Cambridge Bay and a keen bird watcher. He gave us the good news that it was an excellent lemming year. And Kevin found this nest in the tundra. You can see it in the foreground, surrounded by protective rocks. When we first inspected the nest, it contained 7 eggs and 1 newly hatched chick, so it was here that we set up our hide. I didn't have to wait long before the female, who does all the incubating, flew back to her nesting site. Landing a little way away, she half hopped, half flew to the nest itself. And then came long hours of patient sitting and incubating. Every 2 or 3 hours, the male would fly in with a fresh lemming, and there would be a lemming transfer ceremony. Then he would fly off,
and she would take the lemming and feed it to her chicks. After a few days, several eggs had hatched, and the chicks were hungry for food. After a good meal, they were placid and evidently quite content. So life went on, as I continued for many hours to eavesdrop on the comings and goings at the nest. So I hope you will join me in celebrating this sensational bird and the fulfillment of my 23-year-long quest. Well, thank you very much. I'm glad you enjoyed it. For about 45 years. And one of the most lovely birds there is the chough. The chough belongs to the crow family, and it's jet black, except for a scarlet bill and scarlet legs and feet. And the combination of scarlet and jet black is very beautiful, wonderful livery they have. And they nest in the caves along the Pembrokeshire cliffs, and I see them really when I'm down there virtually every day, although they're regarded as rare because they're not found anywhere else. They're not found on the south coast or the east coast, only on the west coast. They used to be called the Cornish chough, but there are none in Cornwall at the moment. They're hoping to reintroduce them. Does the snowy owl have natural enemies? Yes, I think a fox would take them, but they would give it a bad time. They would dive bomb it without doubt. I think it isn't the parents that are vulnerable so much as their chicks before they've learned properly to fly. Sorry, what is remarkable, did I say? I said the snowy owl was remarkable. I don't know. Did I say that? Well, its beauty, I think, is simply, as you saw, that it is snow white, pure white. The male is usually completely white. The female is flecked a little bit with brown and black. But it just is a beautiful bird to see. Good question. I don't know what happened to the fledglings of the Scottish pair. I think probably they succeeded in breeding and in their flying. I think so, because the island was quickly put out of bounds. I think the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds, the RSPB, got it protected so that people wouldn't disturb the nest.
How close was your eye to the nest itself?
It's quite interesting for those who don't know about bird photography that when you discover a nest and decide you want to photograph it, you have to put up the nest, or put up the blind, the hide, something like 50 yards away, a good distance away. And then you wait 24 hours to make sure that the bird has accepted this intrusion. If it hasn't, if the bird has not returned, you remove the hide and go away and come back a few days later. But if it's accepted, if it's on the nest and has accepted the hide about 50 yards away, you then bring it up to maybe 30 yards. And the same, you wait to see if it's accepted. Then you bring it up. I think I was about 15 feet away. And I had to make sure that it had accepted that. Now, if I had then gone into the hide, the owl would never have come back to the nest. They can count up to 2. And if you go in alone, they know that you're still there. So what you have to do is to get a friend to see you into the nest,
and then to leave you there and walk away rather noisily, carrying a coat at arm's length, which looks like a companion. And then the bird is back on the nest, literally within seconds. It thinks you've gone.
I was intrigued that one of the chicks was being manhandled.
Yeah,
Doesn't that stop,
right.
mother sort of, it's still accepted in the nest?
It is, yes. Our questioner is asking about, it was my friend actually, was handling a snowy owl chick. And is that dangerous? There are some rumors that the parent birds don't come back if they've been handled by human hands. But that is only a legend. It's not true. And the bird certainly came back while we were there.
Apart from the purpose of camouflage, what do you see as the purpose of the white plumage of birds and white coats?
I don't know the purpose of the white plumage except camouflage. I mean, they do come back to their nesting site while there is still patches of snow, so that you wouldn't find the nest by sight unless they're flying. So I think that the camouflage is the main reason. Yeah. Okay. I must finish, I think. I forgot earlier on to tell you one or two of the lessons that birds teach us. I'd like to mention, it's in the book if you're interested, that they teach us gratitude. I remember when I was in Ghana in West Africa a good many years ago, I found that Ghanaians are great lovers of proverbs. They love little epigrams and proverbs. And one of the proverbs I discovered was they said, even the chicken, when it drinks, lifts its head to heaven to thank God for the water. Now, of course, it isn't lifting its head to heaven to thank God for the water, but all birds drink by gravity. They take a sip and they lift their head and it trickles down. All birds except for one order. There are 26 orders of bird, and 25 of them drink by gravity. One order drinks by suction, and that's the pigeons. All the pigeons and the doves in the world drink by suction. So they put their beak down in the puddle or the pond, and they suck. And they never lift their head to heaven to thank God for the water. So I think of the pigeons as the most pagan of all birds, with no gratitude. Okay, well, thank you very much for coming and for being such a nice audience. And I think I'll make my way to the door so that I can sign if you want me to.